Welcome to Global Access. I'm Iain Martin. I'm going to be talking to Professor John Mew about the state of the world order.
Past and Present is the title of this year's edition of Global Access. Is it possible to draw conclusions from past events? Or is man doomed to repeat the mistakes of yesterday? How do authoritarian regimes use their own country's history to secure power? And what role does the individual play? In these interviews, researchers, journalists and writers try to answer these questions. Ever since the late 19th century, world leaders have been thinking about how the interests of the great powers can be balanced to create global stability. But in addition to the political arguments, there has also been an ideological impetus for a functioning world order that shaped the West's view of international relations, says Mew in conversation with Iain Martin.
John, welcome. You've talked about the world order in terms of it being a many-headed monster or a noble pursuit. I mean, this search for some kind of world order, it's not new, is it?
No, I mean, first of all, people are talking about world order today through the lens of a crisis. So the kind of agreed conventional wisdom is that there is a so-called crisis of world order. And you hear that from politicians through to scholars, historians, some wise old heads who've been around for many years. I think you can kind of trace the modern debate about world order to about 2014 when Henry Kissinger produced his book of that name. And it's one of those ideas that there's a crisis of world order that's kind of percolated everywhere. So what I'm really interested in is the origin of the idea and the whole sense of mission that comes with world order, because it's a uniquely Western thing. Now, in the history of international relations, people talk about international order, they talk about regional order, people have talked about imperial orders. If you think about Christianity, it also aspires to some sort of universal order as well. But world order is a more modern thing, and it starts in the West. So if you're thinking about world order, what I really want to do is kind of interrogate that notion. Where does it come from? What does it mean? And the reason why I talk about it being either a noble pursuit or a many-headed monster is that it's an idea that's contested. So those who say it's a many-headed monster associate world order with imperialism, associate world order with the West throwing its weight around. Within the West itself, there are many who associate world order today with globalism or over-aggressive foreign policy, or some of the major mistakes that have been made in US and UK foreign policy from Vietnam through to Iraq. And they see, therefore, world order as a kind of a dangerous thing. They think of often white men sitting around a table drawing up maps of the world. And yet there's another tradition, the noble pursuit tradition, that kind of sits alongside that, which is what I argue has really been in the DNA of Western statecraft, really from the early 20th century. And that idea has provided a kind of a purpose and a form and a direction to Western foreign policy. And that matters because it means that different Western nations at different times in the First and Second World War, throughout the Cold War and even into the post-Cold War era, have been pursuing something, a common script and a common cause. So I think when we contest and tackle world order, we've got to understand that complex, debated, but seriously significant history.
Is the precursor to that what happens with the British in the 19th century, of course, develop an empire? And would you agree that they have a particularly sort of narrow, almost self-interest in order because it's about protecting trading routes, essentially?
Absolutely. When I talk to people from the Chinese government today who talk about their visions of a future international order, they often say, we have a doctrine of non-intervention. We don't want to pursue what the British Empire did, which was this sort of global order. Actually, most historians of the British Empire will tell you it's a more accidental thing. So people talk about informal empire, etc. But by the end of the 19th century, the British Empire did by de facto have a global empire and a diffuse global empire that gave it possessions in different parts of the world and therefore also gave it certain vulnerabilities. An informal empire which was structured in different ways from India through to Australia and elsewhere. So this odd empire grew up, and what happened in the late 19th century is the British, who had the first industrial revolution, had the most powerful and effective navy, got out ahead, if you like, in the race of nations, come up against other nations. including the United States, who by no means is seen as an ally in the 19th century, also Germany as well, who seemed to challenge that empire. So as the British grew more conscious of the fragility, the diffuse nature of their empire, so their rhetoric and their discourse about empire began to shift. And they began to talk, first of all, in terms of a liberal imperialism or imperial federation, and increasingly off the back of that and up to the First World War, of a world order, a different international order. So yes, it is selfish and strategic in the sense the British Empire is trying to preserve itself or renew itself or build into some sort of different form based on sort of certain principles of government. And yet it can be two things at the same time. So that people who would see that would say, oh, it's selfish, it's a strategic self-interest, it's quite nefarious, a little bit dastardly. You think about Sykes-Picot in the First World War. But actually, my argument is that actually at the same time as being all those things, it can also be visionary, noble in its intentions, post-imperial and a genuine desire to move away from empire. But that's the seed of this idea of world order. It comes from the end of the British Empire. It comes also in the English language. It comes from things like the increase of technological communication, steam power, ironclad ships, the telegraph wire, all those natural things. It comes also with Protestantism and missionaries around the world, a sense of Christianity. But it is envisaging something else beyond that. And therefore, you can see in this imperial age these almost scientific sort of sci-fi versions of what a future world order might look like. And they're seen in the writing of H.G. Wells, for example. So Wells goes further than the end of empire. He talks about a world government, potentially, in which the states and societies would melt away. Mankind would be governed by reason and science. And we'd have no more war and borders, all these sort of dreams of the future. So it's an idea that gets ahead of itself. It becomes about much more than empire. And in the second part of it, the real tough quest and the kind of messy story of the 20th century is America's attitude to world order, which oscillates between being suspicious of this ordering project, not really wanting to be too imperial in its actions.
And also wanting to, if you like, dismantle the British Empire. And is there a sense in which the Americans then want to start setting the rules? The British have set the first phase of world order rules or structures, and the Americans are the new power and want to be in charge.
There's a huge debate in American foreign policy as to what to do with this British Empire in different phases of its existence. So first of all, Britain is seen as a rival and a challenger. It's only really in the 1930s that Britain and America put their war plans for fighting each other into the back of a drawer and think, you know what, we probably won't do that. So let's not sort of stretch the idea of a special relationship. This is a tense international competition. And yet what happens is the Americans are presented with this choice. As their power grows informally, they acquire not so much territories, but interests in different parts of the world. And therefore, they don't want a proper British Empire, but they want to move that international order into a different space. So first of all, you have the ideas of Teddy Roosevelt, who actually is an Anglophile, key person in American foreign policy, has this receptivity to the idea of British world order. And then after that, you have the new world order of Woodrow Wilson. So can you create a democratic order? But the point is that the Americans begin to drink the draft that the British have left on the table for them. And it's not a dastardly trick. There's a genuine, interesting debates about international order. There's an attempt to create a vision, but they start, partly through shared English language, having the same discussion. And you really see the first effort at this new world order after the First World War.
Presumably it's also a function of what's happening in finance as well, where in the First World War, Britain goes from being effectively a creditor nation to a debtor nation, and America's fortune, which has been building, in financial terms, America becomes the power because of war loans, etc., and the way in which it keeps the old European powers going. To what extent is it really, is it true that if you have the money and you have the financial clout in terms of market power, then you are going to get to set the rules? The Americans presumably just realize that they are financially the most powerful nation on earth, and they can redesign things.
Yeah, they do realise that, but they're uncertain about the reality and the implications of that power. So the English historian E.H. Carr says that America's offered the leadership of the world in 1918 and turns it down. Woodrow Wilson has this idea of a League of Nations, the 14 points, almost envisages this alternative international system in which war is going to be solved. But the American people do not want to buy into it. So what you have, is you're exactly right, is an American financial order in which you have debtor European nations and this growing US financial behemoth based on the dollar, without any real sort of idea of how you might back that up through power, and there's naval power as well. But America does not want to commit to maintaining the League of Nations, the international order. So you kind of have a reluctant a superpower to borrow, an ambivalent superpower to borrow Henry Kissinger's formulation. And it's only again over the course of the 1930s that you have an alternative argument in the United States, and it comes through Roosevelt and the New Deal. And this is, look, for America to be safe, it has to stand up and preserve that international order that it already controls in financial terms. And that's a slow reckoning. It's a painful reckoning.
It's controversial, isn't it? It's opposed by a lot of isolationist Americans.
And even not just isolationists, you know, cautious realists. There's a huge debate across very different cross-sections of American society. Huge Irish-American lobby that wants nothing to do with, for example, propping up the British Empire, particularly in its hour of need. Roosevelt, throughout the Second World War, is highly conscious of the fact that he needs to bring the American people with him. I've seen these wonderful Secret Intelligence Service files on America First. America First is a serious movement in 1939, 1940, 1941. So, you know, there's always a resistance to that. And even then, a portion of the American elite, particularly the kind of WASP, East Coast educated Europeans, if you like, European Americans, they buy into the idea of American leadership, and it's reflected in the nexus of big business. Rockefeller Foundation, others like that, who in turn fund these international relations schools in places like Chicago and Yale and Princeton and elsewhere. So America kind of trains itself for an imperial position, an empire in denial, if you like, in Neil Ferguson's phrase, but actually in practical terms does assume the world leadership role after 1945 that it rejected in 1918.
But by the time you get to 44, 45, presumably America's investment in winning and being a global power is such that by 1945, when Truman is beginning to redesign the world order, has the opposition essentially vanished?
It hasn't vanished, and it never vanishes in American foreign policy and the American domestic political debate as well. But it is, to a certain extent, beaten in 45 if it is to live another day. But you can see these tensions and debates throughout the war. So you can see it, first of all, in the Atlantic Charter. In the United States, you know, people talk about this love of Churchill. Actually, there's an innate suspicion of Churchill. Churchill's imperialism. Churchill's lack of enthusiasm for the New Deal. The Atlantic Charter is a kind of a negotiation not only between great leaders of the United States and the UK, but also those behind them. So in the UK, you have a coalition government. Roosevelt's sort of New Dealers are more closely aligned to the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. So those kind of connections form, and the Anglo-American conversation is much more at that top level. But even then, there's much ambiguity about it. There's concern the British are trying to prop up their empire in India. There's suspicion. There's huge fallouts over the Second World War on matters of international order. So the British have a number of fallouts with the Americans over, for example, Palestine, the continuation of wartime loans, Lend-Lease, the sharing of nuclear secrets. Things aren't easy. The early stages of the Cold War, when the Russians, who've lost so many people, say, well, we'd like some spoils for this. We'd like territory in North Africa. It's the British Empire that says, no, no, no. To quote the Foreign Secretary, Ernie Bevan, you're coming across the throat of the British Empire. And the Americans say this is rather bemusing imperialist behavior. This is the great game between the two. So it is an uneasy story, but I think the keynote moment is probably the Korean War, where the British government decides it will rearm at great cost. The government almost falls down to stand up for the international order, to stand up for that world order established. And there's something that genuinely is infused in the DNA of every single American leader, arguably up to Trump, arguably perhaps even up to Obama, which is that the pursuit of a world order in different forms is a noble thing, a noble pursuit.
So you mentioned Obama and Trump and this idea of the world order, New World Order, enduring until that point. So it now is really in crisis, surely, with a president like Trump who doesn't even accept the fundamental concepts which have underpinned the security of the West. Do you see this as a blip, something which is going to be corrected when America gets a new president at some point, either in a year's time or in 4 years' time? Or is this a longer-term American trend, a turning away from the world order that it created?
Well, this is where you've got to make a crucial distinction between the language and the vision and the idea, which I think is a huge force in history. That's what I'm saying. It's sort of in the mental DNA. It's a spiritual force, a post-imperial view of the world, a destination point for foreign policy. And yet the idea there's a crisis of world order today. What there is not fundamentally a crisis of the world order. There's a crisis of that vision, that spirit, that almost religious mission to get to a place of world order. That, I think, is gone. And I think that's a natural element of the passing of time. That's the fact that Donald Trump has never shared that view and to a certain extent represents the regurgitation of America's ambiguity about empire. Henry Kissinger says it really starts with Barack Obama. So in his book in 2014, World Order, says Barack Obama is the first post-American president. So he doesn't really buy this idea of exceptionalism. He doesn't buy into the mission. And that's partly a passage of time. That's partly because the threat of the Cold War, which kept American presidents talking about that mission. Eisenhower talked about this civilizational mission. Reagan, who didn't read that much into it historically, also spoke about the moral force of this world order. The first George Bush talked about a new world order on the back of it, but something went wrong in the idea. And, you know, ideas don't last forever. It's a kind of post-religious idea. So I think what you're seeing now is not war and famine. There's parts of the world, the Middle East, in which things are uniquely bad, but by and large, people are healthier, more prosperous, and less warlike. So we're not really in a crisis of the world, war of the worlds, like H.G. Wells's vision. We're in an intellectual crisis, a crisis of purpose and leadership and focus. And therefore, the question is, what comes after the religion goes? And I think that's the unanswered question right now. As China challenges and puts its own version of the world order, can the West construct another one in negotiation with China or perhaps going back to first principles? Where do we go from now? And that uncertainty, I think, is percolating through our politics.
But where does the events of 9/11 and the Iraq War, where do they fit into that story? Because surely they are, whether or not you supported the Iraq War or agreed with America's projection of power, the difficulties that America encountered and its few allies like the UK in the aftermath of 9/11 surely were a grievous blow to this noble idea that you talk about. Whether or not you think that the cause was ultimately noble in its execution, it didn't really sell the idea of world order, stability, pursuit of a noble idea particularly well, did it?
Absolutely. So the world order goes wrong. So what the United States is, this comes in two phases, and you can take this sort of interlude from the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, through to 9/11, this sort of odd space in history, and you look at the Clinton administration or the one-term Bush administration, and what they're trying to do is negotiate what the world is going to look like and what America's responsibility without this rival, without this balance against it. So they have a series of dilemmas in the 1990s, and the dilemmas are always, do we intervene? Do we do the humanitarian thing, and at what cost? They're odd types of dilemmas, they're not existential dilemmas. What happens after 9/11 is you have an impulse and a massive overstretch. So the new world order declared by Bush becomes a new world order, and a democratic world order. It's kind of Wilsonianism on crack, if you like, and it goes very far, overextends itself. The domestic legitimacy of the New Deal foundations of the first vision, the post-war vision, on the Marshall Plan, this idea of reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, those are gone. The domestic contract begins to break. And as the domestic contract begins to break, the international contract begins to break. So there is an aberration, if you like, that the original foundations are lost sight of. America overstretches, America does things it's not proud of. It's very hard to claim that you stand for these higher ideals with torture, Abu Ghraib, all these types of things. So clearly there's an aberration.
Do you see anything in Trump and Trump's approach which suggests to you some kind of coherent attempt to deal with these problems, particularly in terms of the rise of China, where it feels as though whether it's Trump's instincts or the deep instincts of the American state and security and intelligence and defense establishment, it seems as though America has decided that it's time for allies to make a choice. It's attempting to force European allies, and particularly the UK, that has become very deeply embedded with aspects of the Chinese state and Chinese state capitalism. And the Americans are saying this year, effectively, you can't play both ends off against the middle. You either choose the American order or you choose to play with the Chinese.
It's a great question, and there's a number of potential ways of answering it. First of all, those who rallied behind Trump in terms of foreign policy were directly challenging the American foreign policy consensus. So they called it the blob. It's actually a phrase used by Obama's speechwriter and former Deputy Chief of Staff, Ben Rhodes, the blob, the foreign policy establishment. What do the foreign policy establishment believe? Well, they believe in a liberal international order. The Trumpians called it the LIO, or the Rubio, the rules-based international order. So there's a direct insurgency against that, and there's a challenge against that sort of domestic order, the things that led us to Iraq, the things that caused us to hyperextend, globalists, Davos man. So the Trumpian discourse, Trumpian rhetoric, in the first instance, if you take the Bannon-type intellectuals behind it, or pseudo-intellectuals, that was their kind of mission. Now, secondarily, Trump basically doesn't really bind a lot of that history, but that's where he instinctively is. So is there a method in the madness? I think a couple of things you can say about that. First of all, those who've tried to interpret Trumpism and systematize Trumpism often have their fingers burnt. So there's quite a few of sort of deputy assistant secretaries of state, or even his secretaries of state, or his national security advisors, which he burns through pretty quickly. Like Ronald Reagan did it as well. I've always tried to interpret the Trump doctrine, and you can see that in documents coming out of the White House, like the national security strategy. President Trump never read it himself. The national defense strategy, which talks about a new age of great power competition. So there are interpreters of Trumpism. And what I think there is, and when it comes to China, there's actually a consensus. So Trump is a blunt instrument, but basically the center of gravity in US foreign policy has now gone to a place saying, you know what, we were too complacent, we were too flabby, we were too into our Sibyllus and our certain sort of ideas about the world and our own benevolence, and actually we've missed what's happening over the hill, and now it's time to take a kind of a much more robust competitive stance. So the whole instrument has sort of moved over, the dial has shifted, and Trump in many ways is the blunt instrument of that. He's given the siren call, but actually others have followed behind him. So I don't think he's a hidden strategic genius, but I think he's been a kind of a destructive and creative force at the same time. You've got a whole set of different answers. And you mentioned about the Brits being sort of tied up with Chinese inward investment. We're always a few stages behind. So the more that the world order was sort of crumbling, the more we started putting it into our own national security documents. In fact, if you look at the use of the phrase rules-based international order, it goes up from 2010 into various national security documents. We're sort of slow to, and we also think we're very clever as well, the Brits. So we're sort of betting on a Chinese world, and we haven't quite seen the reckoning coming. And the UK and other American allies, Australia perhaps, less so South Korea, but that sort of second level ally of the United States, they're now faced with more dilemmas on the horizon. Huawei being one example of them, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank being the kind of first rehearsal for those dilemmas. So the world is now faced with this difficult challenge between choosing between the two, and America will make its allies choose. And that's what's happening.
Because the European analysis, and the analysis particularly in London, because of the scale of the city of London, was that all of this wealth is being created in Asia, and it is going to be a giant pool, is already a giant pool of savings that effectively needs deployment. So where can it be in terms of time zone, access to markets? Where can it most effectively be deployed? Who can be the broker, if you like, for the new wealth? So the Brits, and to a lesser extent the Europeans, decided that that was going to be Europe. What should the Europeans do now if the Americans are effectively? Because this is going to have a financial implication. It's going to have a technological implication. Presumably, eventually, it will have defence implications. Do the Europeans effectively just have to renounce China, or give up on ideas of inward investment, or how draconian are the Americans going to be?
Not that draconian, because on certain issues like the sort of economic ties, America is, indebted to China, right? It's dependent on Chinese money, and the intertwining of the American and Chinese economic systems is already much more complex than even in the European Asian sort of linkage. So no one can kind of shut down the barriers, have a kind of Cold War trade embargo. That's not going to happen. What you are going to have is second and third order dilemmas. And the British approach, I would call it the have your cake and eat it approach, which is, enjoy the fruits of being under the American security umbrella, NATO and those other things. and all the advantages that gives you in terms of intelligence and the broad, big market with the United States, but also be first with cap in hand for inward Chinese investment, using the City of London to kind of cycle this money through. That's going to become more difficult to navigate. I mean, if I was a British Foreign Secretary, that's exactly what I would do. I would try and navigate those two things, but the choices, the sharpness of the choices and dilemmas are going to get harder and harder to navigate. Because America will, when the UK joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, there was a bit of finger wagging in the US Treasury, but that was it. It didn't go any higher. Huawei is a different thing. There was high-level emissaries. It's one reason why President Trump came recently to the UK, and we got a ticking off and a scolding. That's a kind of unfolding of the nature of the dilemma and the drama. But again, Britain thought it could have its cake and eat it, because what middle-sized power is further away from China in terms of influence, right? I mean, we're in a cyber world, etc. There's lots of things that it could do to make our life difficult. But someone like a country like Australia, which is even more economically dependent on China and trading links with China than it is on the United States, but is simultaneously dependent on American security and always has been. That's the sharp end of the dilemma, okay? So Australia has its China question. And I think we're going to, in the UK and in Europe, we're going to have to face with a lot of the similar questions going forward as well. And I don't think it's about, will China and America go to war? It's not about that. It's actually about the nature of the balance that's going to be arranged between the two of them. So Kissinger has this phrase when he talks about US-China relations, co-evolution. It's not fashionable at the moment. Kissinger's not fashionable. He's seen as too soft on China. So you have another version of this, which is this Thucydides trap, or containment, or the new Cold War. So America will find, and China will find, some sort of balance, I think, stopping short of major all-out war. That's because we're all in big trouble if there's a major all-out war. So what does that balance look like by 2050? What does that balance look like by 2070? And what does that mean for second, third order powers, for the rules-based system? That's the kind of the key bit to navigate going forward. And I think we don't really have the answer in Europe, certainly in the UK. People think they've got the answer. They thought they'd be quite clever about it. But I think America's sort of saying, no, you can't have your cake and eat it anymore. And China's getting very angry if the Brits pull out of Huawei. We get scolded again. We get told we're going to be in trouble for this. So this is I think, is what happens when two powers go at it. You have second and third order dilemmas.
We began talking about the British Empire and navigation and trade routes. Do you think this really complex new dispensation, can it be navigated successfully? Do you feel relatively optimistic about the decades ahead?
Yeah, I actually do feel optimistic. It's very easy to kind of slip into what I would call Spenglerian doom. Everyone in the West always goes through these cycles of fear of decline, and they're often really periods of sort of domestic rebirth and protracted political struggle and the kind of rewriting of social contracts. But actually, we're wealthier, we're healthier, and by and large, we're safer. There's new threats, new challenges, new insecurities. So, let's recognize those dilemmas. Let's talk through them, whether they be through Brexit, and let's not self-flagellate too much. And let's try and work towards sort of navigable solution. I think they can be navigated. What I think can't be done is we kind of trick ourselves into kind of simplistic narratives about the world, or we don't think these challenges are coming, and we think we can sort of skirt them under the grass. So we need to be more strategic. I would say grand strategic in the way we think about the world order. I think our sort of foreign policy establishment often just returns the same old cliches and likes to lecture, and we like to be civilized and hope everyone can get on in the world. I think we've got to be much more competitive, sharp-elbowed, sensible, cautious, prudent. Not prudent in the fearful sense, but prudent as Machiavelli would understand that. Prudence means daring as well. And I think we're out of that habit, because we, the West, has been the net beneficiary, particularly the UK, of the status quo. And the status quo is now shaken. So, what are you going to do? Cling to the status quo like a kind of a raft in the middle of the ocean and keep on saying liberal international order and scold Trump for walking out of the Iranian nuclear deal? Or you're going to throw everything out, burn it all down and say that's discredited, that's a bad move as well. Well, what would a Burkean do? Burkean would preserve the best elements of the old, think creatively and effectively about the new elements. So, and I've got a strapline for this. I would call it conservative internationalism. Internationalists, we in those places that matter around the world. We should be in the South China Sea. We're very careful what we do there. We should be in those markets, so we should be bearing in mind what what one relationship with one country does to the other. We should think about how those things synchronize and think grand strategically, but we shouldn't slip into one despair narrative on the one side or some sort of clever guess on the other. So that's I think it can be navigated, but no simple answer to it.
On that fascinating note, the concept of conservative internationalism, John Bew, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.